we've been talking about other states. I know that you have been working on how to use private equity to help with public infrastructure dating all the way back to 2005 and working with TxDOT during a period where we were looking for more tools in the toolbox, so to speak. We were a bit more cash strapped and really struggling to move our program forward. You worked to help us become one of the first DOTs to use FHWA's SEP 15 program. How do you feel like private equity can help to rescue cash-strapped states or help states deal with the ups and downs of revenue fluctuations such as those that we've seen in 2020?
Oh, Marc, that's a great question. That's a question that's near and dear to my heart because obviously I spent a big chunk of my career answering that question. And I'm going to give you the answer that economists and lawyers love when you ask the question, can private equity help? And that is, it depends, right? A lot of it depends on the circumstances you find yourselves in. As we talked about a little bit earlier, there is an opportunity using pre-development agreements and the fact that there is cash available that the private sector has to deploy in infrastructure. There's literally hundreds of billions of dollars around the globe in infrastructure funds that would love to invest in US infrastructure, but moving that money requires a way to pay those investors back, requires the ability to have innovative procurement processes, and requires kind of a level of savviness and experience on the government side to know how to best attract that capital, but do it in a manner that is generating value for taxpayers. So, while these investors are there and happy to invest, they are motivated by a return on that investment, and there can be an occasion of misalignment of incentives. So it's important for governments to be savvy about that as they engage in public-private partnerships. And one, as I talk about private equity infrastructure, I want to just put a huge stake in one concept, and that is that private investment in infrastructure is not free money. This is an issue that drove me nuts when I was in the White House and trying to work with the media and explain what our position was, because they would always report. I mean, I think everyone but Bloomberg got this wrong. They would report that the administration's bill is funded primarily with private equity. And as you and I know, private equity is a source of financing. Think of it as a loan, right? You have to pay it back. So you can't have private equity fund anything. You can have private equity fill in gaps. You can have private equity bring private talent to the table to spur innovation. You can have private equity bring discipline to a project to get it executed on time. But you can't have private equity fund a project. And it was amazing. It didn't matter how often I tried to explain this concept, people would end with, so we're going to pay for this with private equity. And I remember it was quite some time ago. I was talking to a governor of the state, and I was explaining this concept, and he was very excited because he had these infrastructure projects that didn't have funding, and he'd heard about all this private equity. Like, this is great because I'll now be able to bring this private equity to fund this project. And I had to explain to him that, no, well, private equity can be helpful, but you have to pay it back, and obviously you have to pay it back with interest. So it's going to come at some cost. And he looked at me straight in the eye and said, well, what the hell good is that? So I want to dispel this myth that private equity is free money that will build projects. It can be an incredibly useful tool, and it has been deployed in TxDOT, my home state of Virginia, California, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, all across the country. It is a great tool, but it is not free money. So with that, let me pivot and ask you a question, Marc. And this kind of goes along the lines of the last question, which we're looking into the future. So with everything you've been through, the pandemic, the response, managing this enormous program, let's assume you're sitting down 10 years from now with your successor. I mean, you're a young guy, but let's assume it's not you, that 10 years from now there is a successor. What would you tell him or her based upon what you've learned through the last few years?
Well, that's a great question, DJ. And your discussion that you just had on the previous item it really highlights some of the challenge that we have in our industry, and that I or my successors would have is being able to explain the very complicated process of transportation funding and finance to those policymakers that we have to work with and rely upon to make those resources available and help them understand what can be a very complicated topic. And quite often you have policymakers that are coming into this brand new. Their background has not been on the transportation side. And so explaining this to them in an effective way is always very challenging. But as I previously talked about, being adaptable is critically important. Things can change quickly, either from an economic standpoint or a policy standpoint. And you have to understand in our role that our mission is to deliver the transportation system and address the needs of the state and the people that we serve. And we have to be able to adapt things to what the economy or the policymakers may give us. And sometimes they give, and sometimes they take away. But nevertheless, we still have a role and responsibility. We also have to be resilient and to have a backup plan should things change, and not only a backup plan on a revenue side, but also a backup plan from a project development side, being able to change project priorities if you need to, being able to have projects on the shelf if we come into a situation where we have unexpected revenue sources, and be able to move those forward. But we also have to have an eye on the future and be able to communicate that effectively. And I've got a slide here that I want to briefly put up that talks about our motor vehicle fuels tax and the revenues associated with this. And I know this is a familiar topic to you and anybody who's been involved in this area. Motor fuel tax revenues historically have been resilient and predictable. They have shown some steady growth in terms of current dollars, 42% growth from 1999 to 2018 in the state of Texas. But when you look at those revenues relative to constant dollars, the issue is worse. And we've seen a 6% decline, and that's represented by the kind of the gold colored line at the top. The current revenue projection is the red colored line, kind of showing that steady increase that I mentioned before. But we're really losing ground just relative to the inflation impacts associated with motor fuel taxes. And then if you take on and layer onto that the fact that over the same time period in Texas, we've seen a 35.6% increase in Texas vehicle miles of travel, indicating that with slightly less effective revenue, we're having to address the needs of over 30% more of demand on our system. That really pushes, places a challenge on this revenue source, not only at the state level, but as you know, at the federal level, this is the primary revenue source that we have to work with. And then, going forward, the topic of improving fuel efficiency, transitioning to electric vehicles, that is going to be a significant impact on the growth and availability of motor fuel tax revenue to support our transportation system. And so for myself and others, being able to look to the future and communicate that topic to your policymakers and others, so they understand how these revenue sources may be changing in the future and what impact that may have to our transportation system. That's an important conversation to be having. So DG, let me pivot a little bit and throw a question back to you, and it's kind of related to this. It's a good transition to my comment, is that back in August, you released a paper on how governments might best manage meeting infrastructure needs through an economic downturn. In short, what did your paper recommend?
So really the paper, thank you, Mark, for that question. Really the paper touched on three different topics. First, how states and local governments, basically anybody who's developing governmental infrastructure, might benefit from lower costs that typically come from an economic downturn. Secondly, how pre-development agreements might be used to help offset some cash flow challenges. And then finally, talked about progressive procurement and how a more partnership approach might be used to help lower costs as well. So let me take each of those in turn. I think I have a slide here that shows a little bit about historically what's happened in terms of costs. This comes from the Congressional Budget Office, and it looks at the last recessions that we've had. And as you can see here, and it's obviously somewhat intuitive, that as the economy slows, prices drop. And so back in the 90s, back in the 80s, and then in the 90s, and then during the global financial crisis, all of those time periods, we saw a significant reduction in the cost increase of capital projects. So we could take that down because I'm not sure we need much more than that. But it is somewhat intuitive that costs come down. And so this is a perfect time for governments that have projects that are on the shelf or projects that are critical to their communities to move those projects forward. So that is somewhat obvious, but the challenge comes back, okay, well, that's great, but we're in a financial crunch. Where do I find the capital to advance these projects? Which leads to the second point, and that is pre-development agreements. And pre-development agreements, Marc, as you're familiar with, because Texas has done them, and a few other states around the country have done them as well, essentially allows the government to rely on the private sector to fund the development costs of a project early on. So these are particularly useful if you're not exactly sure exactly what you want to develop and you'd like to use the private sector's capital and expertise to figure that out. Or in the case of an economic downturn, if you don't have the capital available now, but will in the future, allows governments to advance projects as they go forward. So there's a little bit of a silver lining in economic downturns, which is there is private sector capital out there that will allow you to continue your program moving and not just stop because you don't have cash available today. And then the final thing that the report touched on is this idea of progressive procurement. One of the challenges of P3 projects in particular, so these are public-private partnership projects that involve private equity, is it's attractive, and in some cases it's quite wise, to get fixed price, fixed time contracts early in the procurement process. And what that does is allows for maximum competitive tension and locks your private partner into prices early on. The downside to that is if your project, particularly like social infrastructure, if you're building schools or courthouses, is going to have the potential to change over the course of procurement, what you end up doing by locking in prices very, very early is that your developer who's putting this deal together will go out for bids to the developer subcontractors. All of those subcontractors will add in a very healthy contingency. Why? Because this is early in the procurement phase, right? And so the subcontractor knows some things are going to change. And what progressive procurement allows is it allows the government and the private sector to partner together and then lock in those subcontractor prices later as we go through the process. So the paper touched on, kind of the pros. There's some cons as well. Obviously, there's to the extent that you are negotiating with one party, you lose competitive tension. So you need to be particularly attuned to the fact as a government that you need to be rigorous on price control as you go through the procurement process. But the paper talked about, how do you respond to this crisis? The good news is, as you mentioned, the paper was released in August. We're putting together in June and July, is the economy has been much stronger than we anticipated at this point. So hopefully some of these lessons won't need to be put in place because our economy will continue to be strong.